September the 1st, 1983, 36,000 feet above the Sea of Japan, is far off course and moving through Soviet-restricted airspace. Inside the cockpit, the crew believes the aircraft is following its programmed route. On Soviet radar screens, it looks like an intruder. In minutes, Major Gennady Osipovich will fire 2 missiles into the night. The aircraft will remain in the air for several agonizing minutes before vanishing from radar. And 25 days later, in the same atmosphere of panic and suspicion, a Soviet early warning officer named Stanislav Petrov will be told that American nuclear missiles are inbound. This is the story of the navigation error that killed 269 people and helped push 1983 toward the edge of World War III. The disaster does not begin with missiles. It begins quietly, in a cockpit that thinks everything is normal. The passengers are sleeping, eating, reading, trying to survive an overnight Pacific crossing. The crew is not panicking. No alarm is screaming. No one on board understands that the aircraft is no longer following the route it was supposed to follow. Every minute, the 747 moves farther from safety. Every minute, it becomes harder for Soviet radar operators to believe this is a mistake. That is the terrifying part of KAL 007. The plane did not have to be attacked to become doomed. It only had to drift long enough for a technical error to enter a political nightmare. The most frightening part is not that Soviet missiles eventually found it. It is that almost every system involved believed it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The cockpit followed the mode it was given. Radar followed its assumptions. Commanders followed their orders. The aircraft kept moving. And the trap kept closing. Korean Airlines Flight 007 left New York on August 31, 1983, bound for Seoul with a stopover in Anchorage. On board were 246 passengers and 23 crew members, including United States Congressman Larry McDonald. The aircraft was a Boeing 747-230B with triple redundant inertial navigation systems. The machine was built to know where it was. The problem was not that the aircraft lacked navigation. The problem was that the crew appears to have trusted the wrong mode. The Boeing 747's autopilot had 2 critical modes for long-distance flight. The first was heading mode, which simply held the aircraft on a constant compass direction. The second was inertial navigation system mode, which used onboard computers to follow a pre-programmed route with waypoints across the Pacific. For a flight this long, the crew needed INS mode. It would automatically correct for wind drift, Earth's rotation, and fuel burn. Heading mode would not. Somewhere between Anchorage and the waypoint called Nabi, the crew either forgot to engage INS mode or engaged it incorrectly. The aircraft's flight management computer showed INS was active, but it wasn't. The plane was flying on heading and slowly, steadily, drifting north into Soviet airspace. Every mile of drift made the mistake look less like a mistake. At the same moment, the Soviet Union was on the highest military alert it had experienced in years. Just weeks earlier, President Ronald Reagan had delivered his Evil Empire speech. He had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system that Moscow interpreted as preparation for a first strike. The Soviet air defense forces were jumpy, exhausted, and operating under standing orders to treat any unidentified aircraft in restricted zones as a potential threat. The KGB had issued warnings about possible American reconnaissance flights probing Soviet air defenses. The stage was set for a catastrophic misperception. A civilian airliner, off course by over 300 miles, was entering the most paranoid airspace on Earth. After leaving Anchorage, Flight 007 first crossed Soviet-controlled airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. Soviet radar picked it up. Fighter jets were scrambled from nearby bases, MiG-23s and Su-15s, armed with air-to-air missiles and operating under heightened rules of engagement. Soviet commanders assumed the worst. An American RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft probing their defenses, testing response time, and mapping radar coverage. The Soviet fighters caught up with Flight 007 over the Sea of Japan. The lead interceptor was flown by Major Gennady Osipovich of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He was flying an Su-15 Flagon, a supersonic interceptor designed to stop incoming bombers before they could reach Soviet targets. Osipovich later said he could see the aircraft's lights, but his controllers were telling him this was a hostile intruder. He fired warning cannon bursts from behind and below, but the rounds were not the clear visual signal Moscow later claimed. The crew of Flight 007 did not respond. Whether they never saw the shots, misunderstood the situation, or were simply unaware they were being intercepted, the silence confirmed the Soviet chain of command's worst assumption. At 3:26 a.m. Japan and Korea time, Major Osipovich received final authorization to engage. He later said he believed the aircraft was on a spy mission, a maskirovka, designed to confuse Soviet defenses. He lined up his Su-15, locked his radar onto the 747's massive radar cross-section, and fired 2 R-98 air-to-air missiles. One detonated near the tail, the other exploded near the wing. The Boeing 747 did not disintegrate immediately. It began a damaged descent, its crew fighting controls that no longer responded. Minutes later, Flight 007 vanished from radar near Moneron Island, west of Sakhalin. All 269 people aboard were killed. There were no survivors. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. In a televised address days later, President Reagan called the shootdown a crime against humanity and an act of barbarism. The United States demanded a full international investigation. The Soviet Union, trapped in its own paranoia, doubled down. Moscow claimed the aircraft was on a spy mission, that it had deliberately violated Soviet airspace, that it was equipped with surveillance equipment, that the civilian passengers were a cover story. For 25 days, the superpowers glared at each other over the wreckage. Diplomatic contact became colder, narrower, and more accusatory. Neither side backed down. Neither side blinked. But while diplomats exchanged accusations, evidence was building. Intercepted Soviet communications, radar tracking, and later international investigation showed the outline of the disaster more clearly than Moscow's denials did. The core fact was brutal. This was a civilian airliner that had wandered far off course into a military system primed for suspicion. There was no proof of a deliberate passenger aircraft spy mission. There was no clean moral mystery. There was a navigation failure, a paranoid command system, and 269 dead people. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, launched a full investigation. It took 10 years, but in 1993 they released their final report. The conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. The crew of Flight 007 had failed to properly engage the inertial navigation system. The aircraft had flown in heading mode for over 5 hours, drifting steadily northward. At no point did the crew verify their actual position against their planned route. At no point did they notice they were 365 miles off course. The ICAO report was blunt. This was a catastrophic failure of basic airmanship, compounded by a Cold War environment that turned a navigation error into a massacre. The human cost of KAL 007 defies easy comprehension. 269 families lost someone that night. A sitting member of the United States Congress was dead. The youngest victim was a 2-year-old child. The oldest was 72. They were returning home from visits, from vacations, from business trips. They were not soldiers. They were not spies. They were not participants in the Cold War. They were collateral damage in a conflict they had no part in. The Soviet pilot, Gennady Osipovich, later said he did not know it was a civilian aircraft until after he fired. He said he was following orders. He said he believed he was defending his country. The tragedy is that he may have been telling the truth. One consequence reached far beyond the crisis. After KAL 007, the United States moved to make the global positioning system available for civilian use once it was completed. The logic was brutal and clear. a system designed for military precision could also help prevent civilian aircraft from becoming lost over the ocean. But the most profound consequence was psychological. For 25 days after the shootdown, every news cycle brought new accusations. Every diplomatic statement raised tensions. And then, on September 26th, exactly 25 days after KAL 007 went down, a Soviet early warning satellite reported 5 American ICBMs inbound toward Moscow. That September 26th incident, the Petrov incident, is the subject of another episode. But KAL 007 helped create the emotional weather around it. Soviet operators were expecting deception. Commanders were primed for American aggression. Radar blips and satellite signals were no longer technical data. They were possible evidence of a world-ending plot. The story of Korean Airlines Flight 007 does not end with the impact. It continues in the Petrov incident that followed. In 2026, the lesson is not that navigation has been solved. It is that misidentification remains one of the oldest pathways to escalation. Civilian aircraft still pass near war zones. Military pilots still operate under rules of engagement written for worst-case assumptions. Stanislav Petrov's decision to call the warning a malfunction did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the shadow of a passenger plane that had been shot out of the sky less than a month earlier. In 2026, the lesson is not that navigation has been solved. It is that misidentification remains one of the oldest pathways to escalation. Civilian aircraft still pass near war zones. Military pilots still operate under rules of engagement written for worst-case assumptions. Air defense operators still make decisions with incomplete information. GPS, ADS-B and satellite tracking make the sky more visible than it was in 1983. But visibility is not trust. A signal can identify an aircraft. It cannot force a frightened command system to believe what it sees. But visibility is not trust. A signal can identify an aircraft. It cannot force a frightened command system to believe what it sees. Technology has improved. The underlying danger has not. A defensive radar operator can still misread a civilian aircraft. A military pilot can still inherit the assumptions of commanders on the ground. It is a warning that one error, entering one paranoid system at the wrong moment, can become much larger than itself. The KAL 007 incident also exposed the fragility of Cold War diplomacy. For 25 days, the superpowers exchanged accusations instead of information. The hotline, designed for exactly this scenario, became a channel for blame more than de-escalation. In 2026, with decision time compressed by faster weapons and automated warning systems, that kind of slow-motion crisis may not be available. The luxury of time, waiting for evidence, verifying claims, letting emotions cool, is disappearing. Major Gennady Osipovich lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He never expressed public remorse, but he never defended his actions as heroic either. He said he was a soldier following orders. He died in 2015. Still maintaining that he believed he was intercepting a spy plane. The families of the victims received compensation from the Soviet Union in the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR. But no amount of money could restore what was lost. 269 lives ended because of a switch in the wrong position, and the world was changed forever. It crossed water and border lines without understanding either. The failure was human, procedural, and political. A crew failed to verify. A defense network failed to identify. A command system failed to slow down. A superpower failed to imagine that the object on its screen might be a mistake instead of a plot. In the end, KAL 007 is a story about the intersection of human error and geopolitical paranoia. The Cold War did not cause the navigation mistake, but it turned the mistake into a massacre, and the massacre into a superpower confrontation. A cockpit error became a presidential address. A radar track became a moral indictment. and 269 civilians became unwilling evidence in a struggle between two systems that already believed the worst about each other. The 25 days between KAL 007 and the Petrov incident were one of the most dangerous sustained windows of the late Cold War. Not because either side had already decided on war, but because both sides were interpreting the same world through fear. Every radar return had a story attached to it. Every exercise looked suspicious. Every denial sounded like proof of guilt. We survived that window, but survival was not guaranteed. It required evidence. It required hesitation. And it required individuals inside vast systems to doubt the first answer the machine gave them. Today, every civilian flight crossing contested airspace carries the memory of KAL 007, whether passengers know it or not. The sky is safer than it was in 1983. It is not safe. Pilots still get tired. Controllers still miss things. Militaries still treat uncertainty as danger. The warning of Flight 007 is not that one switch can kill. It is that one mistake, entering one paranoid system at the wrong moment, can become much larger than itself. The story of Korean Airlines Flight 007 does not end with the impact. It continues in the Petrov incident that followed. It continues in Able Archer, where a NATO exercise looked too real to Moscow. And it continues in every military system asked to decide, too quickly, whether the object on the screen is an error, a civilian, or the beginning of war. We must remember the 269. We must remember the 25 days. We must remember that the brink is not a moment, it is a condition. Subscribe to Turning Point Histories so you don't miss the next chapter. New videos every week. In the next video, we move from the skies over the Pacific to a strip of water 21 miles wide. 1/5 of the world's oil flows through it every day. An Iranian military doctrine that doesn't need to sink a single ship to close it. And a global economy that could start unraveling in 72 hours. Stay tuned for the Strait of Hormuz. 300 miles off course. 2 missiles. 269 lives. 25 days of silence. One world left. Stay with us.